Nocn vLearn launches to all Nocn Group centres for programmes, qualifications and bespoke accreditation. vLearn is a custom-branded, easy-to-use virtual learning environment to empower your tutors and learners by utilising the most cutting-edge technology, including a learning management system, digital content, artificial intelligence and chatbots. The following topics will be the first to launch: tutor support for qualifications and bespoke accreditation, assessment materials and mock examination content, hundreds of ready-to-go digital learning courses. vLearn provides all of the features you need in one place. All of this for only £20 per month per centre, learner fee for only £2 per learner per month. Contact your Nocn Group account manager at business-inquiries@nocn.org.uk to become a part of the vLearn experience. Nocn vLearn.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. I trust that we are all well. Giving you a virtual wave this morning. You should have a questions box, which you can also use to post comments, or equally tell me how glorious a morning it is looking out the window here, watching the blossom blow down the street in southeast London. My name is Nick Linford, and you'll be hearing more from me about the FE white paper. But before we do that, let's just make sure that you can see and hear me okay, and give me a little message to say hi. Hi Teresa, hi Nigel. Oh, Teresa's in Shooters Hill, that's down the road from me. Hello Colin, hello Rachel, hello Carol. Morning to you all. Morning Debbie, morning Lisa. I'm going to stop saying good morning to everyone because we have about 800 people tuning in at the moment. So but it's great to have Darren, Eve, Julia, Mike, Lisa, probably about 30 Lisas and 20 Eves and so on, whatnot. But everyone is starting now to use the questions box, which is great to have a bit of that two-way feed going. Nobody else can see what you're typing apart from me, so you can type anything you want, and then I will choose whether or not to embarrass you by naming you. No, I wouldn't do that to you. I would never do that to you. So good morning, everyone from around the country. Anyone tuning in from abroad? I'll happily accept one of the devolved nations as abroad, but I won't accept a devolved mayoral combined authority yet as abroad. Oh, another person just down the road, David in New Cross. So we're just going to use this minute or so left now until we get to 35 past 10 to make sure that the technology is working well for you and that you can hear me okay and see me okay. But we all seem to be going well. So this is the running order for this morning. We are technically in week 3 of this webcast series in partnership with our friends at Nocn Group, but we're going to be covering today the second chapter in the white paper because, of course, in week 1 we covered the summary, so it's essentially the whole document with the kind of key author of the white paper in the department, Keith Smith. Then last week we covered arguably the most important chapter in terms of employer-led and reinvigorating the idea of employers leading the way in the skills system, which I'll reference again in a moment. And we're coming on now to look at the second chapter, which has the title Providing Advanced Technical and Higher Technical Skills. So I'll be doing a little overview, which is going to start in a moment. Then delighted again to hear from Graham Hasting-Evans, the Chief Executive at Nocn Group. And then, as we have done the last week, we'll have a little roundtable, nice, very select special guests, our VVIPs. We've this week got for you, as you can see here on the slide, Tom Bewick, the Chief Executive of the Federation of Awarding Bodies, obviously a key organisation with any conversation and or consultation and or reform implementation associated with qualifications. We're going to hear from Professor Lorna Unwin from the UCL's Institute of Education, a name may be very familiar to many of you, one of the leading lights in the research world for our sector of education and skills. And then, of course, Graham Hasting-Evans will be joining us as well for that little round table with me, and we'll have a bit of an in-conversation about this particular chapter or anything else that we'd like to cover. And we'll try, we've got lots of time, so we'll try and ensure that we can, perhaps more than we were able last week, to get some of you involved with your comments and questions as well. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get into the first session now, which is, as I say, just me walking us through the second chapter of the FE white paper. So, oh, and I should say, of course, I forgot to mention, these slides and the recording will be sent to you after the session, so please don't feel the need to write everything down or screenshot. So we will send this out, make it available to you, both the slides, as I say, and the recording. So this is a slide I use each week just to remind everyone of the white paper, what it looks like, beautiful front cover. It's been many years now since the department gave up trying to create interesting front covers, so we have a rather dull, bland white paper front cover, although I guess it is white, so that maybe that's by design. And actually, I keep calling it FE white paper because I think that's what we should call it. But technically, it's been called Skills for Jobs, Lifelong Learning for Opportunity and Growth. And there may well be a debate about whether an FE white paper should just be about skills for jobs. But that's the title they've given it, and we'll talk a bit about what that might mean in reality with regard to the actual policies and reforms when it comes to servicing and supporting our economy and the employers that make up that economy. This is, of course, just for England, so it's worth saying at this stage, a very significant document. I've tried to give you some numerical insights into the document, which are fairly meaningless other than to kind of reinforce the point that it is a very, very wide-ranging white paper. It's not about introducing and explaining one new policy by any means. It really covers the whole of the reform program pretty much at the moment. Well, certainly post-16 age group, and but it's worth saying that we do operate our education policy, nearly all of it, in a devolved space as far as the Four Nations are concerned. So we are only talking about England with regard to this particular white paper. So very wide-ranging, and I'm going to use this slide again because I do want to remind you that whilst we're not particularly focusing on with the second chapter on arguably the biggest theme, although all the chapters do actually link back. But I just want to remind you that, in my opinion at least, that the point about this white paper, other than to kind of try and bring all of or many of the reforms together in a single document, is that this is a white paper which is designed primarily, in my view, to go some way further to what the Secretary of State, Gavin Williamson, refers to as strengthening links between employers and further education providers. And as I said last week, in reality, when you read the small print or the pages beyond the summary or beyond the executive summary, really here we're talking about colleges. So this is the government's attempt with this white paper to have another go at basically getting colleges to do what employers want. That's really, for me, is the point of this white paper. And the reason why it's a white paper is because a white paper is a cross-departmental document to indicate, with cross-departmental support, that there will be primary legislation. Typically, it's primary legislation in the form of what I'll call, until they give me another name for it, the FE bill. We don't know when that's going to be introduced yet, but we do know that many lawyers have been working on it for some time, I hear. And I think, based on conversations that we had with Keith Smith a couple of weeks ago, and reading a bit between the lines in the document itself, I think that the nutty bit of this legislation is primarily going to be around making colleges comply when it comes to doing what the employers want. So there'll be these local skills improvement plans, and the job of the college is to do what the plan says. Otherwise, the legislation says that the Secretary of State can intervene. So there will be essentially legal powers for the government to force colleges to do what they want, which they hope they won't use, I suppose. But it would seem that the incentive regimes through funding and so on, are not enough for the government. They want to introduce new legislation. So that's, for me, the point. That's why we've got a white paper. We've not had a white paper by my math over a decade. White papers indicate that there will be legislation. We could have just had, if there wasn't legislation, we could have just had another reform document or a consultation and then reform document. But the white paper does indicate there's legislation. So that's the point for me, just to repeat the point primarily. But the white paper does pull together a bunch of other reforms and indicate some tweaks and changes to the existing further education and skills policy arena as well. So we're going to focus here on chapter 2 of 5 chapters. No reason to suggest that this is the second most important chapter, though I would stress, in my opinion, that the chapter 1 is the most important chapter. And if you've not seen the webcast from last week, then please do have a look at that on our YouTube channel. But we're going to be focusing on the second chapter, which is titled Providing Advanced Technical and Higher Technical Skills. Probably, I think, certainly my deputy editor, Billy at FE Week, would tell me that's too many uses of the word technical, but I'm just quoting from the document. That's the chapter name. So we'll be covering that chapter today, and then the following 3 chapters in the next 3 weeks. So hope to see you on future Tuesdays. So chapter 2. So here you should be able to see the second chapter and essentially the sub-chapters within that chapter. So what are we really talking about in the white paper when it comes to providing these advanced technical and higher technical skills? So there's a section on the National Skills Fund that we'll look at. There's a section on the Institutes of Technology that we'll look at. There's a section on T-levels, then something around reforming higher technical education, and then finally something on progression routes. Now, not wanting you to tune out now by any means, but it's worth saying that chapter 2, I would suggest a few indications of some future changes, but very much for me pulling together an existing reform program across these areas. Many of them you'll be familiar with, you've read about in FE Week, you'll have read about from documents from gov.uk. So not a chapter really about new legislation, new policies that we perhaps weren't familiar with as far as chapter 1 is concerned. This chapter 2 is very much pulling together things that you may be familiar with some tweaks, but I'll reference those in a moment. So before we jump into the National Skills Fund, there is a kind of an intro to the chapter, which I've tried to pull together. But by starting with, I think it's probably worth reflecting on this sentence from Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education. This was part of a speech that he gave after just 2 months in the job. We've reported it on FE Week at the time. So this is dating back to 2009, if my memory serves me correctly. We were in Manchester, I forget, Manchester or Birmingham, they all blend into each other, for the Conservative Party's annual conference. As I say, Gavin Williamson had only been appointed at the end of July, so this was just 2 months into the job. And he said, I'm setting a new target to supercharge further education over the next decade. Our aim is to overtake Germany in the opportunities we offer to those studying technical routes by 2029. So that's just 8 years from now. So as I say, that was at the Conservative Party conference 2 months into the job. And I think this is quite an important commitment or target, in fact, as he calls it here. And we joke, many of us, about the government's obsession with Germany, but this almost takes us a bit further now with not just wanting to be like Germany, but it's the first time I've seen the government indicate they actually want to overtake or beat Germany in this area. And the reference to supercharge, if you recall, this coming in September, before the Manifesto commitments for additional funding, which we'll come on to. So what does the white paper say here in this second chapter? So then it says, we need to support the improvement of the skills at the right level if we are to close the gap with international competitors. So the white paper is indicating supporting a particular level, what they refer to as skills at the right level, and it talks very much about a focus at level 4 and 5, although you'll notice there are a number of policies being introduced that will cover and funded from the National Skills Fund, which are really very much at level 3, and then some of those at level 4 and 5 as well. But very much a focus here at level 4 and 5, that kind of gap between typically the FE sector, which has typically been level 3 and below, and then the higher education sector, which has typically been level 5 plus. So this is a description here about this idea about competing with our neighbours or internationally. And then we get this line in the white paper as well. So it's what I've referred to as an ongoing obsession with comparing the UK to Germany. The white paper says only 10% of all adults aged 20 to 45 hold a level 4 or 5 qualification as their highest, compared to around 20% of adults in Germany. So this is, for me, these two sentences are very, very important in this white paper. It's certainly with regard to chapter 2, very important as to why the additional money is being focused in particular areas. We've spoken before, many of you, around where's the reform program, where's the extra money at level 2 or below, or but the government very much moving away from level 2. If any of you have been in the sector as long as I have, you'll remember big level 2 programs back in when Labour Party was in government, through things like Train to Gain, also prioritising through what then were referred to as public service agreement targets. If any of you remember those from about 15 years ago. Yes, I know I look very young, but I was working at college at the time. This is very much pushing the levels higher now than we've had under previous significant injections of new money. It's through things like Train to Gain at level 2. Now we're getting significant injections of new money, which we'll look at under the National Skills Fund on the next slide, but really very focused at 3 and above, and a longer term reform will be very much at level 4 and 5. So this kind of ongoing obsession with Germany, and we have asked, we are asking at the moment the Department for Education whether they actually have a target in mind here. So did what Gavin Williamson say back in September 2019 with reference to target, did that translate into, is the target to overtake at level 4 and 5 this 20% in Germany? Is the target to be at 21% or above? Is it to be just higher than Germany, whatever they are, around about 2029? Or are they simply talking about the amount of qualifications available across the sectors that are available to adults? It's not clear when we're asking. I'm interested to hear, as we will speak later, from the views from Graham, Tom, and Professor Unwin around this international comparators. They're all 3 of them have been carefully selected, Tom, Lorna, and Graham, because of their knowledge and experience around international skills, VET, we sometimes refer to the vocational education training around the world. So for very much this chapter, kind of looking across the water around the world, and you'll see links in the chapter to various research reports in other countries, including a very long one fairly recently published around the skills system in Germany. Nigel wants me to remind everyone that the rest of that particular sentence, I didn't think it was necessary, but they also mentioned Canada. That's true, at 34% achieving at level 4 and 5. Although no doubt if I started to unpick the calculation methodologies, they would be different between the different countries. So there's always comes with a healthy stats warning on this type of thing. Anyway, we're trying to find out whether there is actually a target which we're working towards. Something that does crop up quite a lot in conversations about policy is, yeah, but what's the definition of success here? The key point about this slide is everything then kind of follows from this. So what they want to do is focus at level 3 and above. So there's new money to supercharge the FE sector, but it's targeted at level 3 and above, and in particular sectors as well, focused, as you'll see, around the STEM, science, technology, engineering, manufacturing. That's where the new money is being spent. Why? Because we're competing. And I remember, this is takes me back a bit now. I did a master's at Bewick in lifelong learning back in 2010, and that was very much about policy back in 2010. And that was when the Labour Party was coming to the end, obviously, then of the Labour Party period, but very much dating to when the Labour Party became obsessed with India and China and the skills race to ensure that we were delivering qualifications that would help us compete with India and China. We moved away from lifelong learning as it was originally intended with the original David Blunkett Green Paper. We moved away from that, and I think this is very much for me, is a kind of a reintroduction of that competitiveness. But instead of competing with India and China, we're talking about specifically competing with Germany, and a focus at a higher level than we had perhaps 12, 15 years ago. So first section within this chapter then. So how are we going to supercharge? We're going to do it with new money. So if you go back and have a look at the manifesto, the Conservative manifesto, then you'll see, so this is the Boris Johnson government, and Gavin Williamson takes a lot of pride, his personal pride, in having got this money into, he claims he got this money into the manifesto. So these might look like small numbers, but these are in millions. So you've got 600 million in the current financial year as we are now, and then that rises to 612 million the year after, 624 million the year after that. And the manifesto commitment was that this would be an additional investment of £2.5 billion over 5 years. So fair enough, I think, to supercharge. This is a lot of additional new money, and you'll see very much is being used at the moment to focus on level 3 and above. Having said that, some of it is now actually being used as part of the this new money is being used as part of the COVID recovery, which we'll see in a moment. And what we're finding, and this is something that I've been quite critical of the government of, they are rather rushing to spend it, one might argue, which is resulting in them struggling to actually spend it. So what they've actually committed in the current year is actually not 600 million as per the manifesto commitment. They've committed 375 million. Although the last time we asked the DFE, and we're putting these slides together made me think that we'll actually ask again. They said that don't worry, the government are still committing to spending the full 2.5 billion over the 5 years. So you would expect, therefore, that perhaps more than 600 million will be spent next year or the year after that, and so on, to kind of catch up for the underspend of the 125 million. But it is all new money, so that's a very positive thing. So how is this being spent to supercharge us in a way that will us compete and maybe even beat Germany at their own skills game? So we've got the adult level 3 offer. So this is National Skills Fund is being spent on this. This is important to understand. This is a ring-fenced National Skills Fund. It can't be spent on anything else, but it is being routed through the adult education budget as a transitionary arrangement before they actually fully roll out a new kind of, we assume, a new funding methodology and way of getting access to this National Skills Fund. So the adult level 3 offer starts next month. That was first announced under the Lifetime Skills Guarantee brand back in October by back end of September, early October, by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, when he visited Exeter College. So a bit more on that in a moment. Then you've got the boot camps. This is at level 3 and above, very much focused for the time being on higher level IT skills. Really important to understand that boot camps are higher level qualifications, and in particular STEM subjects. So we've got digital, very specific digital areas, and then we've got coming on stream some high level areas in construction and engineering as well. Pilots have already started there, but we've got a bit more of a national rollout happening over the next few months. And then probably something that wasn't going to happen, but then COVID hit. I don't think they were planning on a significant new investment in traineeships, if I'm being honest, but COVID hit, and so I would argue they've rediverted some of the National Skills Fund money, because this doesn't particularly help compete directly with Germany at those higher level technical skills. So they've redirected some of this money now to be spent on helping young people get into work through traineeships, and they've not just additional money for more traineeships, but they've made traineeships much more financially attractive, increased the funding rates, made them available to more people, and so on. And a few other little bits and pieces that I don't really think warrant a separate mention right now. So then, as far as this National Skills Fund is concerned, we still haven't actually seen any detail about the long-term implementation of this National Skills Fund. We hope to see that in the consultation that is being worked on at the moment. Keith Smith told us that it would be published in the spring, but wouldn't commit to the definition of spring when it came to actual dates in the diary. Bob's asking where he finds table 1. That table 1 on the screen, just to repeat, is from the Conservative Manifesto. So you can just Google Conservative Manifesto and you'll find it there's a separate document called Costings. So it's in the Costings document for the Conservative Party's manifesto. So as I say, consultation due out soon. I'm very hopeful it'll be quite a detailed consultation with that don't just have lots of questions and high-level questions at that. But if the consultations for the apprenticeship funding reforms were anything to go by, that's probably what will happen. You may recall for the apprenticeship funding reforms, we had the Richard Review, then we had about 3 consultations after that, before we actually had the implementation in May 2017. So this is very much similar, I think, to in scale to the apprenticeship reforms, as far as entirely reforming the funding methodology and the way that it's spent. So really important consultation, and we're in this, what the ESFA is calling, the funding agency is calling a transition period at the moment. I suspect moving away from the adult education budget, at least at a national level, towards a new national skills fund. And if you've been doing this as long as I have, you'll know that every 5, 6, maybe now 10 years, but certainly at least every decade, we completely reinvent the FE funding methodologies, the FE funding formula. Very much keeps me busy, and that's what we've got to look forward to over the coming years. One of the things that's not yet clear, for example, someone asking about this is how will the level 4 and 5s be funded? Will they be funded through the National Skills Fund? One presumes so. Under current arrangements, that wouldn't be possible. That they would have to be funded through the Office for Students. So very significant reform program happening there. Bootcamps is a slightly different situation. I think they can be funded in that scenario. So very much, as I say, a transition period. And this is something that we talked about with Keith Smith 2 weeks ago, where Keith kept talking about wanting a simple funding approach. Very much, I think, taking a lead probably from the skills minister. Every minister wants to simplify things. Who would argue against simplification, especially if they're ever so confused by the FE sector when they take up their post. Then they say, why is it ever so complicated? Let's simplify it. But Keith did. The director of the DfE, Keith Smith, did, as we reported, did admit that things aren't just complicated now, they're getting more complicated as they introduce new things during this transition period. So certainly complexity exists. It's getting more complex, not less, but no doubt over the coming months you'll hear lots of reference from the government to simplification, and you can say, well, I'll believe it when I see it. So just a couple of slides you can take away with you if you're not too familiar with these programs. I've talked about them before and you may be familiar with them already because they're not new now, they're being implemented. We've got detail on them. So what is the adult level 3 offer? They're fully funded for those without a full level 3, which is full level 3 is equivalent to 2 full A levels. There are only 387 at the moment qualifications eligible for the adult full level 3 offer, although the majority of those 207 aren't even on the level 3 entitlement list. They're quite short courses. The government have decided to pay extra funding in addition to the adult education budget rates of either 150 for the shorter quals or £600 extra for the larger quals. As I've mentioned, they're funded through the adult education budget, but for the adults, those aged 24 plus, which is really who this policy is aimed at, it's ring-fence funding, but it is eligible, it is available to 90-23s, and they do get the uplift as well. I would argue very much this policy is kind of being rushed through AEB. There's it's complicated things slightly with the ongoing AEB tendering, and it is what I refer to as a hot mess. But no time for that right now. We might talk about this particular offer, which is coming in from next month with our round table. But I could give you a very long list of what makes it a hot mess, but perhaps we'll save that for later. And I should say, of course, anything going through the AEB only gets more complicated. As I've said right from the beginning, when devolution was first talked about, anything involving AEB, adult education budget, will have an impact on the devolved authorities, those mayoral combined authorities, including, say, for example, in London, the GLA. They all have their own way of funding AEB, increasingly shifting from the way that the national AEB is used. So it only gets more complicated now that we have policies impacting on the devolved nations as well. Sorry, not devolved nations, the devolved authorities. Then we've got the skills bootcamps. Government still keeps calling them digital bootcamps for no obvious reason, given they're being rolled out into engineering and construction now. So I think the safest thing is to call them skills bootcamps. The government is fixated now on calling them the bootcamps. That's something that I think that between the number 10 and the Treasury they came up with. Not entirely sure the DfE is comfortable with the word bootcamps, but that is what they are using. So let's use their terminology so we all know what we're talking about. These quals are free to learners. They're typically 12 to 16 weeks, level 3 and above. Up to 43 million has been committed next academic year through two £80 million tenders plus a bit saved behind for use. They are for unemployed people, but also for employed people. So if people are employed, then the employer pays a cash contribution of 30%. Which is quite interesting given apprenticeships. With apprenticeships, the employers only pay 5%, so not sure how joined up this policy is. We're waiting on the results of the tenders any minute now. The government didn't commit to a particular deadline, so it's not clear whether they're overdue or not, but we should get them at some point this month, find out who's won these tenders. Completely different funding formula they've come up with, which they sort of say they're testing, but haven't done any consultation on, which is unfortunate. So they're talking about they're going to be spending 30% of the funding on the start, 60% for the achievement, and then remaining 10% for an eligible progression. There's more detail in the tender docs about this, but it's not at a particularly technical level. They're not using the ILR, the Individualised Learner Record, which is what we use in the further education skills sector to record enrolments and then for national statistics to be produced, which I think is a major mistake. As we've reported in FE Week, these are limited to high-level IT, engineering, construction. So it should have gone without saying that the government should have realised that this was inevitably going to lead, I think, to a very high percentage of male participants. So it'd be interesting to see if any other sectors come on stream, like health and care. But it seems unlikely if they're going to be so fixated at the higher levels in very STEM subjects. And no sign of Ofsted. At the moment, Ofsted have been told by the government that they're not inspecting this, which is bizarre. I would expect a U-turn on that. I would expect within 6 months from now, we'll find out that Ofsted are actually going to be doing quality inspections in this space. So again, another new policy. And interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, Keith Smith describing these two policies, the adult level 3 offer and the skills camp offer, as, I think I put words in his mouth, but basically saying, look, you know, this isn't the long-term plan. These are kind of quick fixes. So don't read in too much into these as being the long-term strategy. But that's what we are. Many of you on the line will be involved in these operationally. This is what you have to actually manage. Right. I wanted to spend a lot of time on that first part of the first chapter because everything else in the chapter is more or less kind of telling you what you should already know, probably. So then we find out about Institute of Technology. Nothing new in here at all. The first wave were announced a couple of years ago. FE Week pointed out that there were some massive cold spots in various regions of the country that had no IoTs. So then the department said, oh yeah, we're going to fill those. So it took a year or so, and then they put out another tender for wave 2 that were specifically for the cold spots, which is good, I guess. And we're currently going through that second wave. They've chilled out the government a little bit now in saying that all of these IoTs are open and up and running. That was one of the things that the Conservative Party said and claimed during the election, pre-election period, so when they were campaigning. But reality is that some are more up and running than others at the moment, and we've got the second wave being rolled out, being very much more led by colleges, but involving other partners, and focused again at the higher levels and in the STEM area. So new capital money being spent here, and one presumes the plan is once the buildings are all up and running, they'll be running the courses, which they are being worked on at the moment. T-levels, I'm not sure why there's a T-levels chapter particularly in this document, if I'm being honest. I suppose it makes sense. Nothing new we didn't know, but I did want to flag up this line here. I don't know whether the people on the round table have a view on this, but I found this line strange. We are consulting on adaptations that could be introduced to make them more appropriate for learners with prior experience and flexible delivery needs as part of the review of the post-16 qualifications. Not really too sure what the government's getting there in terms of prior experience. Doesn't really spell it out for me what an adaptation would be to make them more appropriate for learners with prior experience. given the T-levels are for 16-year-olds, 16 and 17-year-olds. So what do they mean by prior experience? It could be, although I'm not sure they spell this out at all in the white paper, it could be that they're talking about adults. So obviously, maybe that's something that we could have a conversation about with our special guests on the round table. Is T-levels very low numbers on T-levels, very focused in wave one. Government will say that they're being very cautious and careful, but could we see as part of the reforms that T-levels are opened up to those to people that aren't age 16? I think is what they're getting at there, but they just don't spell it out, which is unfortunate. Reformed higher technical education. Basically talking about, there's more information in another chapter on this, basically talking about employers having more of a role in the design of the qualifications. Nothing particularly new there, but I think giving the Institute for Apprenticeship Technical Education much broader role beyond doing trailblazer developments for apprenticeships. Trying to align some of these things better with T-levels and so on, and getting some clarity around some clarity around who's doing quality assurance here. Is it Ofsted? Is it the OFS? They've made it Ofsted. Finally, they've made it Ofsted now. As of next month, they've made it Ofsted for apprenticeships at level 5 and 6, or level 6 and 7 at least, certainly. So not clear. White paper says they'll tidy that up as to say whether it's the Office for Students or Ofsted. And then finally, clear progression routes. Again, a section which doesn't really provide much detail at all. So you can have a little read of a couple of bits I pulled out here. Promises here to actually use outcome-based success measures for something, to actually change the way that they're using their performance tables and national achievement rate tables. Promises. We've heard this many times, but it's never really filtered through when it comes to providers demonstrating progress. Something that I think is really, really important that as a sector we're able to really numerically demonstrate through the performance and incentives regime. So finally, just a little timetable as I bring in Graham Hasting-Evans now. You can take away with you that we published an FE Week, which I hope is useful to you. We just picked out a few things just on this timeline, not specific to chapter 2, but I hope that was a useful little summary of the chapter for you. And we're now going to hand over to our webcast partner from Nocn Group, the Chief Executive, Graham Hasting-Evans, for a few opening remarks. Graham, if that's okay.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everybody. Great introduction, as usual, and I'm sure we're going to have a lively debate in a few moments. I'm going to specifically focus my comments on the level 4 and 5 for adults. As you say, there's nothing particularly new in this chapter, but a reinstatement of what's already happening. I'm going to start with, there seems to me a rationale to the view that if our economy is going to be more productive, successful, level up, equal, in an increasingly digital world, which focuses on high-end services, sectors such as science, technology, advanced engineering, manufacturing, we need a workforce that has a higher proportion of higher skills. That seems to be obvious. Not forgetting, of course, that we also need lower level skills, such as level 2, they're the backbone of the workforce in many sectors in the economy. I think it's about the balance of investment, and that's about percentages of the workforce. So I'm going to talk to you about a load of numbers. I hope you don't mind. I know Nick loves numbers, and I love numbers too. So I'm going to start with workforce data. In 2019, the workforce is 34 million people, of which 13.2 were at level 4 and level 5. That's 4.55 million. That's different to the 10%, but that 13.2 is for all age groups, whereas in the white paper they talk about 20 to 45 age groups. So that accounts for the difference. Now, the pre-COVID forecast was for the number of people at level 4 and 5 to increase by another 500,000 That's up to 14.3% by 2024, i.e. the next roughly 3 or 4 years. Yeah. And that is still low compared to the international comparator countries that are mentioned in the white paper, Germany at 20, and I think Canada at 34. So if we try to get to say 20% by the end of this decade, the 2030 that's been mentioned, if you do the math, you need 2.5 million more people to be at level 4 and level 5 than we currently have in the workforce. That's the scale of the challenge. I do appreciate that government has not set any targets, perhaps because they've calculated that figure as well, possibly, but that's the sort of scale of it. And to set that into some context, in the 5-year period from 2014 to 2019, we increased the number of people with level 4, level 5 skills by 645,000. Okay, so if at that rate, what we need to achieve to get to 2.5 million is about 4 times that rate just to get to the 20%. To equal Germany. So it's quite a big ask underneath this white paper, which doesn't come through particularly clearly in the white paper, the scale of what's been talked about. Employers in the 2019 survey said they need people with level 4 and level 5 skills, particularly in STEM. So that links to what's being said in the white paper. But saying that, I'm also conscious about the chicken and the egg. What comes first, the employer demand or the people with the skills? Because historically in the UK, there's been a low-level demand from employers for high-level skills. So getting the demand side in place is really quite important. So how might we make this step change in skills? That's what's being talked about. We're talking about 2.5 million people. Well, the National Skills Fund has got 2.5 billion. That's interesting, similar figure. Well, the figures are similar, it's billion and million, funding to enhance and support skills. And that's going to be the vehicle for the Lifetime Skills Guarantee for level 3. And I recognise level 3 is an important platform from which to move to level 4 and 5. But there's no guarantee that move will take place. We're not yet clear how the fund's going to work either, so still early days. So let's turn to some practical options for upskilling people. I think there are 3 main ways that we might want to talk about to do that. First is people taking loans, going back to full-time educational courses, universities, Institute of Technologies, or to some form of model like the Open University. I suppose the question is, how many people will be willing to take on loans and give up 1-2 years of their career to do that? So that's a question that lies around the other one. The second is apprenticeships, funded through the levy. In terms of the number of apprenticeship standards, if we ignore the ones that are withdrawn and retired, we have at the moment 690 standards on the list, IFATE's list, in total, of which 600 are live. There are about 15% standards at level 4, 6 at level 5, so a total of 21. So that sounds encouraging, doesn't it? However, if we look at the starts in 19 to 20, we see that level 4 is about just over 26,000. Level 5 is just over 25,000. I appreciate there's been a low level of starts at the moment, 322,000, which is quite a lot less than the 600,000 a year that's talked about at some stage. But the total is only 52,000 at level 4 and level 5 starts. So that's not very much towards a 2.5 million sort of eventual target, if that's the way it is. And the third way is people in employment being trained and qualified at level 4. Bootcamps appear to be part of that. And under this approach, an individual will get a qualification on perhaps a specific topic, not a full level 4 or level 5 qualification, but part of one, which would help them with a specific skills gap relevant to their employment, employer might want, or the particular way they want to develop their career. And you could see the short duration advanced training courses delivered by the Institute of Technology and universities sort of supporting that. And the curriculum might be parts of a full-time course, might be parts of an occupational standard. So you can start to see that. See, that could be attractive to employers. So that could be part of the route to close the gap of 2.5 million. But how do we encourage this to happen? How is it going to be incentivised, funded, and recognising that over the last 5 or 10 years, there's actually been quite a limited appetite for this. So we need to see how that's going to work. Because we are in the position we are in because individuals and employers to date have not seen the value of raising the number of people at level 4 and level 5. So winning acceptance to this within the population and within the employers is absolutely crucial. Conscious of time, just want to finish. I feel the ambition makes sense to move to a great proportion of the workforce in level 4, level 5. However, the white paper does not articulate how this ambition links to BIS's industrial strategies, for those who listened last week, or the local skills improvements plan. Doesn't come together. So as yet, I cannot see a clear, robust plan in the white paper how we're going to get to much higher levels at level 4 and level 5. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Graham. Appreciate that from you. And we'll be hearing a fair bit more from you now as part of our very select roundtable. If I could invite to join us now Professor Lorna Unwin from the Institute of Education at UCL, Lorna, and of course Tom Bewick, Chief Executive at the Federation of Awarding Bodies. If we could start with you, Professor Unwin, if that's okay. I'm familiar with your work, obviously, having done a lot of my own studying, in fact, in this particular space, including at Birkbeck. And you've written quite a few papers in the past. It's actually specifically about our skills system and comparing it to the German skills system. And I know you're quite a proponent of kind of getting employers involved. I wonder if we could have your take generally on the white paper and then obviously around the second chapter we've been talking about.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, that's good. That's
yep.
great.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Nick, and hello everybody. A couple of remarks to begin with, and perhaps just wanted to say very quickly because I will kind of raise some what I think are quite challenging issues in the white paper, but just quickly to say white papers are very, very useful documents. And I think one of the ways this can be particularly useful and seems to be happening, and obviously through events like this, is it will galvanise the FE sector to, I think, put its views forward and kind of get stuck in with what needs to be done. But two quick points. For me, it raises the issue of what we mean by technical skills, particularly in a contemporary world of work where everybody now is a technician in the sense that virtually every job now involves technical skills, obviously using digital technologies particularly. So that's a thing I think we ought to talk about more. And the second thing is to think about where levels 4 and 5 currently sit, because for many years, and particularly since the new Labour government, and particularly young people, have been given the impression you do level 3 and then you leapfrog to level 6 and do a degree. So this missing section of level 4 and 5, which I think, as Graham shown, still exists, but it's very invisible, and I think that's going to be quite a challenge. So why would you invest there when we've been telling people to go to level 6? So just going back to the notion of what do we mean by technical skills, and we know it's kind of been a long dream of UK policymakers it's quite interesting to be reminded that until the 1950s, the Board of Education called its further education branch the technological branch, or the T branch. So we had civil servants working in a T branch. So that might be something they think about bringing back. But I think the white paper, in some ways, could be a bit off the pace if the reforms coming out of it concentrate too heavily on the sectors that have already been mentioned, engineering, construction, and too heavily on this notion of what is a STEM job. I think they could be off the pace in terms of the modern workforce. And so in terms of employers, I mean, I've written a lot about employer capacity. We have some fantastic employers who do this really well. The problem is we tend to use those as the kind of pin-up boys of the system. And what we need to think about is the many employers of all sizes in all sectors who really struggle to even conceive what good workforce development looks like. And that's often because they're managed by people who've not experienced it themselves. And that's, a difference to the kind of days when apprentices used to be appointed right through to board level and so on. And I thought it was interesting that the budget announced the Help to Grow scheme for SMEs, but it talked about MBA style management training. Well, I think what we need is some really good short cycle interventions, and I think that's where the notion of the college business centres can come in to really help employers think about how to create the learning environments in the workplace that don't just develop skills but actually utilise them, because that's the other problem we have in the country. And the fear would be you might start churning out lots of 4 and 5 qualified people, but the workplace doesn't know how to utilise those skills properly. And then finally, on the race to beat Germany, of course, the big thing that the politicians of all parties never mention is Germany's got a regulated labour market. So that's a huge, it's both a stick and a carrot for employers to have a really good commitment to training. So I think one of the things we could look at is to what extent new developments, including at level 3, but also at level 4 and 5, to what extent can we develop the notion of licenses to practice across more occupations? Because if we did that, I think you'd get more trust in the system from individuals, and it would also put bigger expectations on employers as to what their role is. I'll stop there. Probably said enough.
Thank you, Lorna. As I say, if anyone wants to, if they haven't already, if they want to Google Lorna's name, you'll find lots of research papers specifically in this particular area. I was reading one a moment ago about this issue of employer engagement, both in Germany and in England. It was a kind of comparative piece from about 3 years ago. And as someone has actually referred, someone Phil on the comments here, you came in saying bang on when you were talking about Germany having this regulated employer market. As I understand it, the larger employers certainly they have to employ a training manager. That's like the law. And they have to invest. That's like the law. And I've been doing this 15 years, and all I've seen is the government make it cheaper and less, and put less sticks into the system for employers. I'm not sure that legislation through statutory skills plans is going to really change very much on that front. Tom, are you with us?
Yeah, I just had to change my internet connection. Can you hear me and see me okay?
we can hear you okay, but your webcam is currently paused. Just before we go to Tom, Lorna, I wondered, you obviously have to deal a lot with as a researcher, academic, in the numbers and the stats and the evidence for government claims of things. In your view, should there be a target here? Should there be a definition of success metrically that we can show in 10 years from now it was worth spending all the extra billions? I mean, setting aside whether it's the right intention to policy, if we just look at whether the government will be able to say they've achieved it or not, should there be some targets, and what would you focus on? Put on the spot.
I understand that policymakers, do need targets. I mean, they need to have something to work towards, and obviously in terms of how the money's spent, etc. I noticed John Hayes' call for a target for T-levels, but I think targets are dangerous, and and certainly dangerous in England. We don't have a very good history of using targets in a sensible way. And I thought it was interesting that Graham, or I think perhaps you, Nick, actually, talked about that sentence in the white paper about prior experience. And, to what extent, I think that's a hint towards a credit-based system and going back to, some of the kind of recognition of prior learning that was big, in the 90s. The danger there is you start to go down the route which we've gone down a bit too much with adult apprenticeship, where you accredit existing learning, which can be very important and obviously very motivating for individuals. But if you kind of do it, if you let that take over, then you're moving away from the learning of new skills, new learning. So I think the targets, my fear would be if you start saying, we want X 100,000 level 4s by 2026 or whatever, what will that mean? And will it mean full level 4, 5?
Yeah.
Will it mean people have got chunks of, and that's where it gets dodgy.
I remember very well the public service agreement government target, 40% of the workforce at full level 2, which translated into a lot of game playing at an operational level with the Learning and Skills Council and the colleges and training providers, and then ultimately the public demise of Train to Gain and all of the fallout from that. So definitely worth heeding your words of wisdom there, Lorna. Tom, welcome. Great to have you with us. You're very experienced globe-trotting around the world, looking at other international ways of doing things. Are we doing this right? Let's have your opening remarks, please, if we may, around the white paper.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Hopefully you can see as well as hear me now. But yeah, I mean, I just want to first of all come back and respond to a couple of things that have been said already. I mean, Lorna mentioned the sort of intent of the new Labour government, and I had a slight sort of wry smile, because she's absolutely right. From the point of view of 20 years or so, the outcome, as it were, of our post-compulsory education system has been to culturally want to drive more and more learners from level 3 attainment right up to level 6 with no stop in between. I mean, that's an absolute fact. But I smile because I dug out this morning actually when I was preparing to come on your wonderful webinar series, this note I wrote for David Blunkett back in it was December 1988, and it was in advance of a seminar which the Secretary of State was leading with Tony Blair and his advisors in number 10 on the whole issue of what to do about post-16, and in particular what to do about technical education and skills. And I can tell you, in this restricted policy document, there's absolutely nothing in here that does not appear also in this white paper. In other words, for 20 years, we've been talking essentially the same about the same challenge, which is this perceived gap at international level, at the technical level, what we in our qualifications framework obviously refer to level 4 and 5. In other countries, it's referred to usually as intermediate level skills. And you know, the fact is, what's happened over the last 20 years is, you know, when I go back to that Downing Street seminar and my recollection of the discussion, not least the point here about the intent of the Labour government was to develop 2-year associate degrees focused on technical and business skills, drawing on the experience of the American model. In other words, what the intent was that in return for more money going into the university and higher education system, the universities would respond by, in effect, in some ways, rejuvenating what had been successful about the old polytechnic model, you know, the focus on vocational and technical careers, the focus more on part-time, the focus more on these so-called 2-year associate degrees. And for a short while, with the money that went into the so-called foundation degree program, we did see at its height around about 300,000 students who were going through the foundation degree model. Two things went wrong with that. The first thing is that what many universities interpreted the foundation degree program as being was just an excuse to rebrand 3-year full-time degree programs and create 2-year programs that were then a progression through to 3-year full-time bachelor degree programs. So we didn't see the American style community college associate degree program being developed in this country. So no wonder we end up by around 2020 with a fall from 300,000 students on the foundation degree program to less than 30,000 students now currently going through that route. So it's not surprising that 20 years on, you know, under a different government, but arguably some of the same officials in the Department for Education, we're still having the same discussion about how do we create this intermediate level progression for learners so that they don't feel they have to go down the culturally pervasive route of full-time degree education. And it seems to me for all the schemes and for all the initiatives and for all the different funding streams, until we culturally question and challenge that key assumption about our post-compulsory education system, we're going to be still stuck in this conversation loop about how we improve our relative performance to other countries. Just one last thought on Germany. I mean, it really frustrates me when I see these, you know, these mantras about we need to overtake Germany. In many ways, our technical vocational system is already better than Germany's. You know, we have a level of innovation and entrepreneurship amongst our technical and vocational ecosystem, which Germany, frankly, would envy. And the reason for that is because with the regional system of vocational schools, with the sometimes quite clunky approaches they have to developing the standards with employers, there's a rigidity associated actually with the German system, which we do not have here. Now, that has its own problems. Sometimes a bit too much market, a bit too much innovation and initiative can actually then be a barrier to progress. And arguably, Germany has a more stable system than we do. But I think, you know, we've got to be honest. In some ways, we're ahead of Germany. We don't have this problem of a huge, at the moment anyway, people stuck in a transition year like they do in Germany with their apprenticeship model. There's a danger, by the way, coming back to the white paper and the T-level program and the idea of this transition year, that we could actually end up replicating one of the problems that Germany has, where you have too many people stuck in a kind of holding pen, and it's very difficult to progress them onto further learning or indeed directly into employment. And when you look at the academic sort of side, because there is a big academic side to T-levels, it's a full-time study program, it's 1,800 guided learning hours. You know, best will in the world, the officials at the department are not estimating any more than 50% of candidates who enrolled on T-levels ever passing a T-level and getting the constituent part, the technical qualification and the industry placement. So 5 years time, folks, that's going to raise a whole new issue for us about what do we do about the 50% that haven't passed T-levels? Where do they go? And that's another, I think, a big challenge looming on the horizon, Nick.
Yeah, interesting that you bring up the retention and achievement rates on T-levels. Anyone with not that long memories will recall that a big reason why the 14 to 19 diploma failed is I think it ended up with about a 7% pass rate. And whilst the government can say, make it gold standard, I think it's fair to say the program's failed if 1 in 10 actually get the qualification. So interesting that you're picking that up. I'm sure FE Week will be interested in more of your views on that, Tom, with regard to potential T-level pass rates. I had an interesting conversation with John Hayes, Sir John Hayes, the former skills minister, just last week about targets and about in the context of T-level, something that Professor Lorna Unwin referred to and we've reported as a story in FE Week, and we really started focusing on the ability to find willing and able, or even existing, employers in the locality to do the industry placement, without which you can't pass, and then it feeds into that pass rate. In that vein, around employers and in the context of designing qualifications, if you will, how do we tackle this issue that Professor Lorna Unwin referred to around this, usual suspects, Siemens and so on, that we usually talk to or visit in Germany, every Secretary of State? I'm sure Gavin would have visited Germany and Siemens had we not had COVID, and certainly Damien Hines did before COVID hit when he was Secretary of State. How do we get the smaller employers and their needs, if we are serious about employer engagement, but without significant sticks like they have in Germany with it being regulated? Perhaps to start with Tom again on that front, and then we'll go to Graham and Lorna around the qualification design. Is it right at the IFA? Are they getting the right employers involved? Is the future plan here over the next 5 years the right plan?
Well, I mean, in the white paper itself, it talks about engaging 300 employers in their whole technical routes and their standards development. And, without sounding too critical of the Institute, because on the whole, I'm a very big supporter of the Institute, and in fact, have called for the sustainability and stability of the Institute for Apprenticeships, for the simple reason that when you look at Germany and Switzerland, they've had their equivalent bodies in place since the 1970s, and they've changed radically over that period of time. But what the government hasn't done, which is what we tend to do, is scrap Quango, scrap institutions, and start all over again. So, I need to be very careful. I'm not calling for that. But, Graham's on this call, and he will remember the Sector Skills Council initiative, combined across those SSCs. I know there was concerns about their performance. Some of them were better than others, etc. But I can tell you there were a lot more than 300 employers involved in developing qualifications and national occupational standards with awarding organisations. And my final point on that would be that, I think it's a misnomer, and it's a myth, frankly, that's grown up around the employer involvement in qualifications design, that somehow employers are or have been absent from that process. I haven't met a single awarding organisation that doesn't have very extensive ways in which it consults with employers. And I think this obsession with getting employers involved in the nitty-gritty of the qualification design and development, again, when you compare this to Germany, yes, they have the BIBB, which sort of operates as a standard setting body, but even their much famed apprenticeship system, only a third of German employers actually take part in it. And we're all on equipment and technology in order to be able to interact with this webinar today, but we don't judge the success of Microsoft by how many different customers it goes out and it gets involved in the development of its products. Microsoft develops great products that hopefully are intuitive and allow users with limited digital and technological skills, though that isn't always the case, to be able to interact. And we decide as consumers whether we want to buy the Microsoft product or another product. And I would put it, to this conversation, that's really where we ought to be getting to around this notion of great qualifications and products for learners and employers. I'd like to see a system that empowers employers and learners, of course, but I don't think that necessarily has to be all organised through the organs of the state. And what this white paper really symbolises is a continuation of a top-down state-led approach to technical education. We won't know for another decade, frankly, whether or not that experiment has worked or not.
Interesting, Graham. This great organ of the state, the Institute for Apprenticeships Technical Education, obviously it would appear there's a big thumbs up in the white paper to expand their remit beyond apprenticeships when it comes to working with employers and the route panels and so on to design these level 4s and level 5s and so on. You've obviously worked a lot with the Institute for Apprenticeships. You've had some strong views around the numbers of standards and where they've been. Is this what's your reaction in a sense to kind of Tom's challenge there around it being too top down?
I agree with Tom, and I think we've made a mistake by getting rid of the sector skills councils and not putting something that filled that gap. Yes, the sector skills council, and some still exist. Some are engaging with thousands and thousands of employers on a daily basis to get the standards right. And I think what I've always argued about the Institute is if you're going to put it in place, it needs to be properly structured, properly resourced, properly governed, and properly linked down. And I think getting in route panels with 10 employers on a route panel, 4 small ones and 2 medium-sized ones and so many big ones, doesn't give you that. I mean, Tom and I, we worked in sector skills councils, and you will remember, Tom, I worked for the UK for Commission for Employment and Skills, and we worked together. And it's incredibly hard to do employer engagement, yeah. And there is no uniform answer. And you might say a bricklayer's easy, only use a bricklayer, but a bricklayer that a master builder SME wants is completely different. The bricklayer that Barrett's wants to throw up houses fast. So even then, you've got all sorts of tensions that you've got to manage. And I think it's under-resourced and too simplistic. And if you take a top-down approach, which is what the government has done, then you get that. There's the silver bullet. Yes, here's the one way of doing it. You've got to do it that way. Here's the template. And it doesn't work particularly well. You end up with problems. Yeah, we've got problems in lots of the standards. I would like to see the Institute now properly structured, properly resourced, and I'd like to see a change to the way that we engage employers that's much more embracing than we currently had. And I think the only way out of some of this mire, yes, is to actually get the list of occupational standards pretty good. Yes. If you get the list of occupational standards good, then you can start to design the qualifications, the apprenticeships, or even the parts of qualifications to give you you only need half of a level 4, yes, yeah, because you've got prior learning. That's your bit. Yes, we know what we're doing, and we just seem to be a million miles away from that. Yes, and we can't dictate from the centre. We can't micromanage the economy from the Department of Education. We've got to let employers have the flexibility. We've got to take on board the various problems that they face, and that's what worries me about even the white paper. Yeah, a skills plan is. I don't see how that's going to properly fit in. It doesn't fit in with the work on the industrial strategies that are being done in sectors, which are really good work, and none of this connects up. And I think, hoping that the Institute will do all of that with the sorts of resources it's got, the way it's governed, and the way the inputs into it are structured, I don't think it's going to work. And I am, it was better to have that than some other things. But so I've been a supporter of the Institute, but it's not structured right. It never has been from day one.
Because we used to have a UK Commission for Employment and Skills, UK CES. I do wonder though whether we have a habit just as human beings of looking at things a bit through rose-tinted glasses after the event. I was never a fan of the UK CES. I found their 300-page documents impenetrable, their 30-slide presentations with font size you couldn't read impenetrable. But I do wonder whether a gap has been left. Obviously, the UK CES was UK-wide, whereas the Institute is England only. That's not great. We talk about progressions and credit accumulations in the future more so. But does that make it harder to get a job in Wales and Scotland if things in Northern Ireland, if things don't quite add up in the way they need to, because there are different systems? Yeah. Look, I'll just come on to Lorna. Lorna, if I may, you've obviously been an academic and an observer of government systems and a view obviously on what they're trying to do, but particularly on the machinations of how they go about doing it. What are the advantages in giving this role to the Institute for Apprenticeships over what's come before, if you can see any?
Gosh, I think we need an institute of some sort, and so I think it was a step forward actually to create it, and particularly to extend its name, because I think it was silly sort of it just being apprenticeship initially. So the extended name I think is helpful. The problem is that, and Tom referred to the BIBB in Germany, that and I think the difference is the BIB, as it's referred to in Germany, is the federal institute that does all sorts of things, and one of the key things it does is the R&D of the system. So it's the kind of focal point for lots of research and development that is looking, particularly at how the world of work's changing, what the implications are then for the vet system, and so on. And it's very well resourced. It's been in place for many, many years, and that's the big difference. So we have a history of our institutions lasting 5 years, some less than that, before another government, or even within government, the same government, another minister comes along and up pops a new institution. So, and people have talked about this, since time immemorial, that we need more stability in the system. So there's an R&D capacity issue for the system, and we're not good at it in universities. So, there are not many people like me who stuck at it over the years. We need more, research and development going on within education departments and universities, or cross-disciplinary work and so on. So that's an issue. And so I think it comes back to your top-down points and points that both Tom and Graham have made. The Institute has a key role to play, and I think you need a national focal point like that. And the other countries with strong systems have got that. But what those other countries have then is a very good locally organised, or regional and locally organised, a set of arrangements, I would call them, rather than a system. So it's a set of arrangements for bringing the provider institutions and employers together to talk about not just designing qualifications. It's having a much bigger conversation about what's needed to develop workplace expertise, that's needed today. I just wanted to go back to get very quickly to Tom alluded to the awarding bodies, and I think and how they do engage with lots and lots of employers all the time. And I think that's another issue, is parts of our system are invisible. So all that work that's going on that awarding bodies do, and the levels of expertise within awarding bodies, is hidden. That's not the fault of the awarding. I'm not blaming the awarding bodies at all. But I don't think policymakers understand what goes on, the engineering of the system. I don't think they understand that. So I think they think, I'm going out on a limb here, I think there's a tendency to presume awarding bodies are just another part of the system. They don't understand what the role of the awarding bodies is, and it's not just to sell qualifications. It's been
interesting. An interesting exercise watching a couple of the previous reform program kind of consultation of the Nigel Whitehead review, which briefly involved awarding organisations having to send letters of support from their employers. Really interesting points that you make there, Lorna and Tom, about those conversations in the background already taking place, and and happening. Tom, you wanted to come in there. Was there something that?
Well, I mean, I'll just pick up on Lorna's point, because I think it's actually a really powerful point that we shouldn't miss about the whole system. I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody before, obviously, I took this role as Chief Executive of Federation of Awarding Bodies, of not really understanding the role of awarding bodies. I probably had the average sort of prejudice that a relatively senior Whitehall official would have about awarding organisations, which is to see them as a sort of complexity and perhaps superfluous to the post-compulsory education system. But in fact, the more you get into it, the more you go around and you visit these organisations, large and small, niche and mass market players, as Lorna's saying, the more you realise how important pedagogy, quality assurance, curricular design, yes, working with employers, but also working with data specialists, educational experts, how important that is to the quality of the system. And coming back to your globe-trotting point, Nick, about, it's only 10 countries, by the way, that I've worked in, mainly developing countries. If there's one thing that's often missing, when they're looking for advice, about how they do build better technical and vocational systems, what you soon discover about those countries is that they just don't have those experts resident in those countries who can advise. And that's why the World Bank and the IMF and the Asian Development Bank ends up funding a load of sort of pedagogy specialists to go in and help these countries build their technical and vocational systems. So, I think we lose all that at our peril, that expertise, first point. I think secondly, which just comes back to my, complaint here about the drift of the white paper towards ever greater statist intervention in technical education. Fine, if the state wants to assume these responsibilities more and more, then it also needs to, coming back to Graham's point, it needs to accept the resourcing of these things as well. But of course, the moment the state is in a position of resourcing these things, it becomes then an argument about the rest of the education budget and the prioritisation given to schools, prioritisation given to universities. Within the comprehensive spending review, it becomes a conversation between the education service and the health service and the defence and all these other key areas of national resource. Everybody's got a lobbying organisation and can make a case for why their particular part of the system deserves more funding than anybody else, when we've got £2 trillion now of national debt to worry about paying back. So the point about awarding organisations is they're not state bodies. 60% of them are charities. NOCN, Graham, your body's a charity. It operates for public benefit. So why on earth does the state want to increasingly nationalise the delivery and nationalise the resource, when at the end of all this, we as taxpayers will have to end up either picking up the tab for that infrastructure, or we'll have to make cuts, and therefore we'll be in a debate about why is our technical and vocational system poorer compared and relative to other countries. That's my complaint really about it.
One of the things that a few of the people on the line have picked up on, I was just going through from some of the comments and questions, was Lorna's point around licenses to practice. And that's not something in our country that we have a lot of. There's some, I mean, Graham will be familiar with a bit in the construction space. Arguably, there's certainly barriers to entry around some of the IT products. If you don't have certain qualifications in IT, then you'll struggle to work in that particular field. But much beyond that, we don't really use licenses to practice. Some people pointing out that you would need the likes of the CBI on board because of their very powerful lobbying group. Obviously, we've got reference to chambers of commerce and potentially a new role when it comes to what the white paper says, although all the chambers we've spoken to so far just shrug when they say we don't really know what we can do or how we can do it. And they don't really want to talk to FE Week at the moment because they don't really have anything to say, which doesn't bode particularly well if the government are hanging all of their hopes on the chambers as opposed to, say, the local enterprise partnerships. Lorna, can you just talk a little bit more about licenses to practice and why they might be important?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we have very, very few, hardly any at all. And what that means, of course, is in this country, you can set yourself up as anything. I could set myself up as an electrician tomorrow if I wanted to. I'd have to get a certified one to come and, certify the job I'd done was okay. But I could mess about with your electrics. You know, I can certainly cut your hair and do your toenails tomorrow with no training. I can do all sorts of things in this country. That tells you a lot about the country's attitude to skills, because what it means is we don't value a lot of jobs, or we think lots of jobs you just need a bit of induction on the job and you pick it up as you go along. That's part of, Tom referred earlier to the, you know, a cultural shift needed. That's another big cultural shift that I think has been happening. One of the interesting things about COVID is it certainly exposed all of the occupations that the country relies on to keep going, that people generally just dismiss and never think about. So I think what licenses to practice do is they say, to do this job, you have to have been trained. You have to have developed a set of skills that some kind of occupational body, whether it's, you know, a professional body or some other kind of body, has certified at a particular level. That means you can then operate within the workplace, and that doesn't mean you stop at that. You know, you can then obviously go on and develop further. The downside is, you know, what you don't want is to start getting into regulation that then creates bottlenecks in terms of entry to the labour market.
Yeah, because we've seen this, haven't we? We've seen this in our own sector, in the education sector, Lorna, haven't we? We've seen the government with introduction of free schools and so on. There was a period where they were backing away from teachers needing to be qualified at a time when there was a recruitment problem. So it was seen as partly as a solution to the recruitment problem. To speed that up was to remove qualification requirements. But as you say, the downside is that anyone and everyone could potentially do it. And what does that say about your belief in the value of your skill system?
Yeah, well, they wouldn't withdraw training from brain surgeons, even if there was a shortage. So why do it for teachers? Well, that tells you about the value of teachers. So I think you have to be careful about any new forms of regulation, yes. But I think what we're going forward with the white paper, any you know, whatever comes out of it, we ought to do something more ambitious and pilot some licenses to practice. Let's work in some sectors, think about what they might look like and what that mean, and link that to level 3, 4, 5 progression.
Absolutely. I think we're going to wrap up now. I just want to read a comment that somebody called Warwick has just left. So Warwick says, not a question, but what an excellent discussion from people who really do know what this topic is all about. Really good stuff. Recognition of capability through license to practice is vital and a real status for the practitioner. And it's actually, that final point's really got me thinking. I don't typically get involved in conversations about license to practice. In my head, license to practice is an IT course that shouldn't be publicly funded. But actually, in the context that you're describing it, Lorna, I can really now see it's opened my eyes to how things like license to practice can have a very significant impact on the way that the government and others see this, the value of the skills system. Just in 30 seconds, if we may, we'll just go around. We'll start with Graham, then we'll go to Professor Unwin, and we'll finish with Tom. Just 30 seconds, your closing remarks, please.
I'll bring out the license to practice. Some industries self-regulate. Construction is one. They've got a digital card that you will not get onto a construction site to work. It will control whether the machine will start or not. And so you've got certain sectors that are going miles ahead of everybody else, and others where there's nothing. And I think we need to start to use that license. But a very good intervention, Laura, as a concept to try and drive up skills.
Okay, who would like to go next? Should we go, Tom?
I need to say, Nick, that and it's great by the way you're doing this in-depth webinar series on white papers, and thanks again for the invitation. Thanks to Graham as well. And it's great to be on a panel with the distinguished Professor Unwin. But I'll just say that this white paper, I think, is part one of a three-parter white paper. You know, because for me, it's a useful narrative. It brings together the kind of conversations that we can have now with the rest of the sector and indeed the wider public. But it falls well short, I think. Certainly isn't the revolution that Gavin Williamson and other ministers were promising only a few months ago.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Right, Professor Lorna Unwin, your job is to finish us on a high.
On a high. Well, we know how to do this. We know how to do technical education well. We've got a long history of doing it. And there's tons of really excellent practice out there that needs to be built on. Needs to be built on and needs to be made much more visible. So you know, I think we can get this right. What we need, I think, is to get away from this supply-demand, you know, kind of very unsophisticated approach. What we need, I think, is a three-way process. We need individuals, providers, and employers all involved in helping to design and implement a much more workable system. If we leave it, if we leave it all to the employers, which a lot of employers don't want, that's important to say, and a lot of employers I speak to want to be a partner in the process. If we leave it to employers, then what we'll end up with is a very skewed system, as I think Graham alluded to. And we will have no means of rebooting good training provision that's lapsed, for example, in sectors or rather subsectors where they've got no capacity to play the role the white paper thinks they're going to be able to play. So and sorry, one last thing, that the individuals are important. One of my concerns is if I'm a 40-year-old and I want to change career, so I want to go from being a carpenter to being an accountant. How can I do that if the local skills plan, that possibility is not in there? So, you know, the history of certainly FE colleges shows the big demand has always been from individuals wanting to improve themselves. So they have to be part of the picture.
Absolutely, learner-centered, learner-centric. But I would have caveat the saying, but it's public money, so that it doesn't also need to be prioritised and not just always thrown where there is the most demand, in my opinion, as we've perhaps seen with some programmes. Well, listen, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Graham, to Nick, to Graham, to Lorna, and to Tom. This is an opportunity, please. You've got a questions box. Please leave a little message now, if that'd be okay. If you found the webcast useful and enlightening or not, as the case may be. So a little message on your way out. And we very much hope that you will be joining us again for chapter 3 of the 5-chapter white paper, same time, same place, next Tuesday. So it's goodbye from me and
everyone
from our
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.